Science Fiction University.
Hello, and welcome to Science Fiction University.
In this episode, Respect the Writer, we look at how the structures of stories work, their walls and floors and plumbing and so on, and why you mess with the basic structure of an existing work of fiction at your peril. We're your fan and writer hosts. I'm Blue Gal.
And I'm Driftglass, and you can visit Science Fiction University at our website, sciencefictionuniversity, all one word, .com, where you can contribute to this podcast. There's also a Patreon button at our website, or you can mail us a letter and or contribution to Science Fiction University, P.O. Box 9133, Springfield, Illinois, 62791. And this comes with a warning. First of all pronunciations of alien names are done in the Midwest fashion. So we here say Versailles and Marseilles and Lebanon, so suck it up, coastal elites. Second, this episode does contain spoilers for Season 1 of Foundation from 2021, Dune Part 1 from 2022, and Kindred Season 1 also from 2022. And probably Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter and Game of Thrones and any other stories we think are cool and worth mentioning. Foundation, if you're interested, is available on Apple TV. Dune can be found on HBO Max, Hulu, Amazon Prime, and for pay on YouTube. Kindred is currently available on FX on Hulu, and the novels on which they are based are available in public libraries everywhere. Now, this episode is a bit of a cheat since we already talked about the fatal flaw in the Foundation series in a previous episode, and we did touch on Dune. But with the release of the Kindred TV series, we saw an opportunity for coming at them and Kindred all from a different angle. But first, a story, which you might have heard before, but please bear with me. Back when I was studying writing at Columbia College, one of the required courses in the fiction writing department was called writing parody or something like that, which wasn't strictly accurate because the definition of parody is, and I'm quoting now, a literary or musical work in which the style of an author or work is closely imitated for comic effect or in ridicule, unquote. A more accurate way of describing the parody class I took would have been something like plot deconstruction. You would study great works of literary parody for several weeks, and then, in the last half of the semester, you were required to write a parody of your own. The instructor gave us 5 famous short stories to choose from. Nearly everyone chose The Nose by Nikolai Gogol, which, for obvious reasons, it's a hilarious story. I chose The Penal Colony by Franz Kafka. My parody was entitled The Lunar Colony, which really isn't either here or there, but it does show that I've always been a science fiction nerd since I was a little drift glass, maybe even a shot glass, way back when. Anyway, before you can crank out a decent parody of anything, you have to understand the thing you are parodying. You have to understand its formal structure and its plot and its pacing and its characters and what motivates those characters, all those things. And deconstructing a classic story in order to create a new version of that story is a very useful writing exercise because you very quickly learn that if you drop this or omit that or add in this, the story will very soon start to veer off course. For example, a parody of The Nose. If you make the nature and implications of your protagonist's profession very different from that of Gogol's protagonist, or you mess around with too much with his spouse's profession, or the relationship between them, you've changed the inciting incident of the story and the character of the protagonist so much that as you try to map your plot onto Gogol's plot, yours will soon begin to fall apart. You also, hopefully, begin to develop a real respect for the craftsmanship of a good story, how all the pieces fit together snugly and seamlessly, and how hard a thing it is to do well.
In each of our examples today, the writers and directors or showrunners are taking liberties with the original source material for the purposes of adapting it for the screen. Foundation was written by Isaac Asimov and published in 1951. Dune was written by Frank Herbert and published 14 years after Foundation in 1965. Ironically, Kindred was written by Octavia Butler and published 14 years after Dune in 1979. According to Asimov, the idea for Foundation was based on ideas in Edward Gibbon's History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. It is an epic Golden Age science fiction space opera that centers around the collapse of a galactic empire, the establishment of a civilization-preserving foundation, and the fictional science of psychohistory. The Dune universe is set in the far future of humanity and has a canonical history that spans thousands of years. The plot centers around the political intrigue between the social, commercial, governmental, and religious institutions of the future and their fight for control of the unique and miraculous chemical compound called spice.
Spice!
That increases health and longevity, gives some users prophetic visions, and most importantly, makes interstellar travel possible. And it only exists on one planet in the entire universe. Kindred, finally, is a time travel story and is modeled on slave narratives. The novel centers on the collision of power, gender, and race, both in contemporary time and in the antebellum slave-owning South, into which our modern protagonist, a Black woman, is repeatedly and inexplicably dragged. Unlike Dune and Foundation, Kindred was written after the previous generation's strict limits on adult content had disappeared, and it is definitely for an older reader. The book includes period-accurate scenes of rape, beatings, and mutilations, and what can euphemistically be described as racially charged language. In other words, the N-word is used in the book.
Frequently. It's a rough book. It's a period accurate book, but it's a beautiful piece of work. Octavia Butler was a gorgeous writer. Now, Foundation and Dune are both part of a series of books. Kindred, on the other hand, is a standalone novel, and all three of these things are widely and correctly considered to be among the classics of science fiction. Kindred is studied in college classes across the country, except in Florida, apparently, where they're suing.
Yes. Florida has a real problem right now.
Yeah, Florida does not. There's a whole bunch in the history of this country that Florida does not want to talk about. Now, all three of these books also have very huge and very loyal fans. And as we know, fans do not react well when anyone tampers with the books and comics they hold dear. Of course, unless you're filming a Shakespeare play verbatim, there will almost always be changes made to the original material to make it filmable. And that's why it's so very important for anyone adapting a beloved novel for movies or television to have a deep and respectful understanding of the formal structure of the original material, its plot, its pacing, and what motivates its main characters. Changes, sometimes even substantial changes to the original material, can and will be made for a visual medium. Sometimes, as with something like Glengarry Glen Ross, whole new scenes and characters can be added that will actually make the movie or television show better. But all of it needs to be done with great care and a clear understanding of why the original novel works. So, let's talk about the similarities and differences in the approaches of the filmmakers of these various productions.
And first, let's talk about money.
Yeah.
Dune and Foundation were very expensive productions. Dune, which covers only half of the novel, cost $165 million. Foundation, which was a 10-episode run of the first of what was supposed to be 8 seasons, cost $45 million for the first season.
Yeah, that's pricey.
And while we could find no budget out there for Kindred, which ran for 8 episodes and is expected to run for 2 seasons, also it covered roughly the first half of the novel. Regardless of what it cost, it didn't cost $45 million to make.
No, a fraction.
It really was a fraction of what these 2 science fiction movies cost. There are no spaceships in Kindred.
No.
This is the woman is in her apartment and she disappears and she's in the antebellum South. So they had to have sets for that, but they didn't have to have any special effects beyond she disappears. And with Dune and Foundation, yeah, you can see where the money went. Dune won 6 Academy Awards last year for cinematography, editing, score, visual effects, production design, and sound. And the sound in this movie, Dune, is just remarkable. Amazing. Really, really remarkable. Foundation is also visually impressive, Whereas Kindred looks like it reused some of the sets from The Good Lord Bird. It really does, because it's poor country.
Yeah.
And for the modern scenes, it looks like they used a vacant house in Los Angeles.
Which they probably did.
They probably did for some of its major set pieces set in the current day, right?
A nice house. We're not, it's an upscale house, an expensive house, but still.
The other thing is she's just moving into this house.
Right.
So it's not furnished.
Right.
They've got a double bed in there, and that's about it. Clearly, money isn't the issue. Apple TV could spend $45 million on a special effects extravaganza with established movie stars that still screws up the plot of a science fiction classic. While Hulu spent what looks like Foundation's catering budget with a cast of relative unknowns and a lead actress, Mallory Johnson, who is terrific. I think she's really, really good in this.
It's amazing. She's great.
This is her acting debut. And it's pretty good and critically well received. And, it is a different science fiction classic, but they did a good job of putting it on the screen.
Yeah.
Without a lot of money, without the budgets that these other two had, for sure. So, Driftglass, we should need to talk about what went right and what went wrong with these three productions. And what do you judge and how do you base your standard by which we judge these things?
As you know, I'm a man of many opinions, most of which are loud and often wrong. But in this case, I'm a science fiction guy. So some people in our audience might disagree with my choices. I accept that. But I'm going to use the example of The Lord of the Rings as sort of a rough rule of thumb for efficient novel to video adaptation. Because Peter Jackson clearly decided that for his epic filmmaking extravaganza, each single novel in the Tolkien saga equals one movie that's 3+ hours long or so, and that cuts out a few things that fans may miss, but overall does not do irreparable damage to the story. He was very consistent about this. So by that metric, how do Foundation and Dune and Kindred stack up? Well, Dune is a long and extremely complex novel that was thought by many people to be unfilmable. And David Lynch's disastrous 1984 version seemed to make that point really clear. This movie cannot be made. But 36 years later, we have advances in film technology, and it's possible now to put Frank Herbert's vision on the screen in a form that won't send fans like me screaming into the streets. And director Denis Villeneuve very shrewdly decided not to try and gallop through the entire novel in one movie. That's a mistake that Lynch made. Villeneuve broke it into two parts. It's a 412-page novel. He cut it in half, which allows the story he told this time around to breathe and move at the right pace, a pace the audience can enjoy and understand. And Villeneuve also masterfully compacted the story of Spice into a short descriptive montage. We know what the characters are fighting about and for very early and very quickly. Now, Foundation is a different matter. The first book of the original Foundation trilogy comes in at a tight 255 pages, which might make for a very fine 2.5-hour movie. The trilogy and prequels add many more pages. But series writer David Goyer is quoted as saying, quote, "With Foundation, we can tell the story hopefully over the course of 80 episodes, 80 hours, as opposed to trying to condense it all, into 2 or 3 hours of a single film." So he decided to make the first 2 seasons of the show focused on just the first book in the series. Therefore, the showrunners were faced with what we called in a previous episode the Hobbit problem. How to stretch a fairly lean story like Foundation into a 16-hour-long action-packed special effects extravaganza space adventure. And the answer is that they tacked on a bunch of stuff that was certainly visually very impressive, but was also not only superfluous, but it irreparably screwed up the central premise of the novel. Maybe they should have taken that parody class at Columbia College.
Maybe they should.
Yeah.
All right, so let's look at how director Villeneuve packs the first half of Dune into a 3-hour movie without pissing off fans or wrecking the plot. First, Dune is a very interior novel. A lot of this movie is what Paul and Jessica are thinking.
Well, a lot of the novel is. A lot of the novel is what's going on in their heads, what they're thinking about. Mm-hmm.
Right. They're interior monologues. In his 1984 version, David Lynch tried to solve this problem with voiceovers. as
Yeah.
the characters are just standing there,
Yeah.
pretty much. That didn't work at all. What Villeneuve did, he worked to create exterior cues for what was going on inside people's heads, and that worked extremely well. In the novel, the character Liet Kynes is a man who dies in the desert from dehydration. In the movie, Liet Kynes is a woman who is killed by the Emperor's Sardaukar super soldiers. As she dies, Kynes summons a sandworm, which swallows her and her killers whole. This was a very clever way of telling the viewers that even the Sardaukar are no match for the desert power of sandworms and Fremen.
Yeah, it's a great scene because the whole desert floor just drops and this massive mouth opens up and swallows them like they were nothing. And like, oh, that's what they're up against.
The introduction of Baron Harkonnen's nephew, Fade Rotha, was cut, presumably pushed over into part 2, and the role of the Mentats, the human computers that play a large role in the novel, is cut down to a few lines in this first movie. Details of complex politics of Dune, the Spacing Guild, and the Landsraad, and the Missionaria Protectiva are mostly gone, making Dune, the movie, safe for newcomers. We also miss the details of the relationship between Lady Jessica and her maid, the Shadow Mapes, who presents Jessica with a crysknife. Can you explain what that is, Driftglass?
Yeah, crysknife is the ritual weapon of the Fremen. It is made, and you have to understand on Dune, on Arrakis, you don't use blasters on people because blasters are, people wear shields, personal body shields. And when a blaster hits a shield, everything explodes. So it makes knife work and sword work part of the novel. And the Fremen make their ritual knives from the teeth of the sandworm. They're ancient and they're important and they're part of their religion. And you're never, ever supposed to draw your crysknife and put it back in the sheath without drawing blood from somebody. And that's why in the movie, you see them putting their knives away by slashing their own wrists a little bit because it's sacrilege to draw a knife and not draw blood by the Fremen faith.
So this isn't in the movie.
No.
And you notice it. If you love the book, you notice that this is gone, but its absence doesn't damage the overall plot in any way.
Now, the most significant change from Dune the novel to Dune the movie is the elimination of the first paragraph of the first page of the book, which you've read the book, you know what's coming, because it introduces the premise that every chapter thereafter is going to be preceded with an epigraph from Paul Atreides' wife that introduce each chapter in the novel. They all are introduced with a little quote from various sources, and this is the very first one that jumps the novel right off. Quote, "A beginning is the time for taking the most delicate care that the balances are correct. This every sister of the Bene Gesserit knows. To begin your study of the life of Muad'Dib, then, take care that you first place him in his time, born in the 57th year of the Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV, and take the most special care that you locate Muad'Dib in his place, the planet Arrakis. Do not be deceived by the fact that he was born on Caladan and lived his first 15 years there. Arrakis, the planet known as Dune, is forever his place. From the Manual of Muad'Dib by the Princess Irulan." Unquote. Now, this paragraph conveys a lot of information. That there's an organization called the Bene Gesserit, and they will be important. That their form of government is an empire ruled by a person named Shaddam IV. And the central player in the story will be a guy named Muad'Dib. But more important than that is the source of the exposition, the Manual of Muad'Dib, written by someone named Princess Irulan. This is telling the reader, you the reader, how to read the novel. This is what movie directors do. They teach you how to view a movie. In the novel, they're teaching you how to read the book. It tells the reader that in this universe, this man, Muad'Dib, is a historical character. That what they are about to read is a record of things long past, which have been sifted and studied and documented by future generations. The movie radically shifts this perspective. In the movie, events are not a matter of historical record. Instead, we are with Paul and Jessica as the narrative unfolds in real time.
Now, taking popular novels and turning them into good movies requires this ability to see what's important for a visual medium and dispense with everything else. Legendary screenwriter William Goldman explains the most important element in screenwriting. Quote, "Screenplays are structure, and that's all they are. The quality of writing, which is crucial in almost every other form of literature, is not what makes a screenplay work. Structure isn't anything else but telling the story, starting as late as possible, ending each scene as late as possible. You don't want to begin with once upon a time because the audience gets antsy." Unquote. Goldman wrote both the novel, A Princess Bride, and the film adaptation. And since he knew the difference between reading a book and watching a movie, he made changes. In the book, believe it or not, there is no grandfather. Can you imagine The Princess Bride without the grandfather reading the book to the little kid?
Yeah.
And there is a father who spends about the first third of the novel trying to find the book about Buttercup and Wesley. Another example, when Mario Puzo collaborated with Francis Ford Coppola to adapt his Godfather novel for the screen, then ended up cutting more than 2/3 of the book and almost all of the melodrama, and focusing on what makes the novel and the movie work. A family drama about immigrants and criminals and stirring the sauce.
And you got to add a little sugar. And that's my secret.
That's my secret. Well, and you and I tried to listen to the novel, The Godfather, which was a bestseller. I mean, it was
that's why it got
very popular.
Yeah.
But after the first chapter or so, we were just like, this is a potboiler novel.
It is. And
this has, a lot of sex and a lot of this and a lot of that. And it's not about this family, this immigrant family, rising to the top of the mafia, which is what it's about.
And in the novel, an enormous amount of time is taken up talking about Sonny's penis. And there's, I believe, one reference to it visually in the entire movie, which is when I think his wife is gesturing size-wise. This is small, this is medium, and here's my husband. But that's it. That's it. And but you can see why. They really, if you watch, there's a documentary about the making of the Godfather, and they really did like rent a house and sit down for weeks together and cook and think and figure out what it was in the novel that made the novel work, that would be visually appealing and could be done for the price and time they had available to them.
Right.
And that's why it's amazing.
Here's another example. The showrunners and writers on Game of Thrones were faced with the same problem when they had to streamline George R.R. Martin's massive epic down to fit into an HBO TV series. And for the most part, they chose wisely, thanks in no small measure to the fact that Martin is still alive, still writing, and was still available to help them understand the long-term implications of the changes they were considering. Do you remember what the first scene is in Game of Thrones, Driftglass?
I believe in America. No.
No.
Is that it? No?
It's the impact of winter is coming.
Oh, that's right.
And you see these dead people who've clearly been killed by somebody in the north, beyond the wall. And one person, one peasant, survives and has seen all this. And they don't believe him. He goes back to tell people, the White Walkers killed all these people, and saying that is worthy of beheading. And that's how you open the story.
Because the White Walkers are myths. Everyone knows they're myths.
Yeah.
They're not real. They can't be real. No, the first scene I remember is pushing Bran out the window.
Yeah. Yep.
But yeah, it starts off, kind of slow and kind of stately because they had that kind of time. But they were rigorous about making sure that the pieces you need to know and follow and see, and the political relationships and the history, the necessary history you needed to know, how these things came to be, were all there. And then they could say, okay, that's enough. We can build on what we have here, but there's a whole bunch of stuff we just can't include. So let's make sure all the critical stuff is there. Now, Kindred and Foundation have the opposite problem, because in both cases, the original source material does not have enough meat on the bones to fill the number of television hours they were given to tell the story. So both series had to add in lots of stuff that wasn't in the book. Now, so far, we've only seen the first season, but Kindred, the series, does share a lot of DNA with Kindred, the novel. But it also introduces several entirely new characters and storylines that were never in the novel. Here's a few of the biggest changes. The protagonist, Dana, is still an aspiring writer, but instead of being set in 1976 Los Angeles, the series takes place in 2016 Los Angeles, with all those social and technical changes that implies. In the book, the character of Kevin is her husband of several years and is also a writer. He's also white, and in 1976, interracial couples were not nearly as common as they are now. In the series, Kevin is just a waiter with a music background. However, this isn't the biggest change to his character. In the show, Kevin meets Dana while she's having a really awful dinner with her aunt and uncle at the restaurant where he works. He gives her a ride home. They hook up on Tinder. They go out on a date. And it's entirely by accident that he is there when Dana travels to the past and ends up being taken with her eventually. In the book, as Dana's husband, Kevin is aware of everything that's going on and even tries to forge some free slave documents for his wife when he first makes the trip to the past. Another substantial change is that in the book, Dana's mother and father are both dead. In the series, it turns out that while everyone believed both parents died in a car crash, the crash was actually caused by Dana's mother, also being pulled back into the past while she was driving, thus killing her husband because the car just went off the road. In the show, Dana not only meets her long-lost mother, Olivia, but Olivia becomes a key part of Dana's story in the past. The character of Winnie is also created from whole cloth, and she serves an important point in the plot that wasn't in the novel. In the series, Margaret Whalen, who, as the wife of the plantation owner, is a terrible person in her own right, finally leaves her violent, abusive husband. In the book, she never gets to leave. In the show, Dana is pestered in 2016 by nosy neighbors who spy inside her house and finally call the cops on her. All those changes are duly noted. Yet while the show does have its flaws and it drags in places, the central science fiction premise of the plot, a black woman being repeatedly dragged into a terrifying past to protect the life of her awful and white ancestor without whom her entire family would not exist, remains intact. And so despite all the large and small changes to the novel and the fairly low budget, the show still works.
And this is why Foundation, despite its very large budget and very able cast, fails. Because while some of the large changes that were made to the story are merely annoying or somewhat problematic, some are even welcome updates, the key changes to the story do irreparable harm to the central science fiction premise of the plot, that the collapse of the galactic empire is mathematically predictable and inevitable, and that only an outpost established on a specific planet far away from the center of the galaxy and populated with specific kind of people who must be kept ignorant of the Foundation's true purpose can shorten the ensuing dark ages. That's the plot of the Foundation novel. And I have to say, the most welcome changes made to the Foundation novel in the Foundation TV show are adding diversity to the characters.
Yeah, it was great.
Several main characters are now people of color or they're gender swapped. This doesn't affect the plot in any negative way, but it brings women and people of color into the story. A pivotal character named Salvor Hardin is played by a black woman. But in the novel, Salvor Hardin is the first mayor of the town that has grown up around the Foundation, and the character is described as a shrewd politician and negotiator who cleverly and peacefully navigates the first of the Selden crises through which the Foundation will pass to evolve into a galactic power.
Can I amplify on that just a little bit? Salvor Hardin, instead of engaging the people who are attacking the Foundation militarily, because they're grossly outnumbered, offers to give them nuclear technology, which is being lost in the galaxy, the technology to keep things running. The only people who have the knowledge to keep things running and build new stuff are the people at the Foundation. So Salvor Hardin offers to give them like nuclear powering technology to keep their ships running and keep their machines running, which also makes them dependent on the Foundation.
Ah.
And building that dependent relationship over time changes the relationship of who's in charge.
Mm-hmm.
And after that comes a form of religion, a cult around what the Foundation can do that impresses even more kingdoms with their godlike powers. And then comes the trade associations that grow out of the Foundation. So, and all of these crises are precipitated by the normal course of events that Harry Seldon predicts will happen. 30 years from now, this is going to happen. 40 years, it's going to happen. 100 years, it's going to happen. And that's what's necessary to make the Foundation grow. But the reason Salvor Hardin is known in the novel is because he, and now she, or he is peaceful. He's thoughtful. Mm-hmm. He's very careful, and he's very smart. That is not how the TV series describes.
Yeah, I was going to say, in the TV series, Hardin is reimagined as a sort of warrior action hero.
Yeah,
the warden of Terminus. Yeah. And the Hardin of the novel is definitely not a warrior or a comic book action hero. Now, they had to have some action, and clearly you had to have fight scenes in this show. Mm-hmm. But using Hardin for that was a bit of a letdown, I think.
Well, there was also a chase scene, as I recall, where Hardin gets away because some kids conk a bad guy on the head with a wrench.
Right.
I'm like, wait a minute. No, that's not how Seldon crises work. That's not how any of this works. This is not correct. All of these events happen because they're inevitable, not because they're contingent on some kids hitting someone on the head with a wrench. I'm sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah, that's all right. The Emperor's advisor is Demerzel, I believe is how you say it. And they gender swap that one as well.
Yeah, we're allowing Midwest pronunciation.
Pronunciation. They gender swapped this. The Emperor's advisor does not exist in the original trilogy, but only shows up 30 years later in a couple of prequels Asimov wrote to tie his robot series in with his Foundation stories. So you've got to give the writers for the TV series credit in that they knew some of the characters from other Isaac Asimov novels and incorporated them in. The TV show adds in another new character named Rach Foss, who is supposed to be Harry Seldon's closest friend and ultimately his assassin.
Yeah. Now, this is a galactic empire, but in the novel, the Emperor himself plays almost no role, very minor character in the ongoing trilogy, because the whole point of Asimov's story is that, according to the science of psychohistory, it doesn't matter what the Emperor does or does not do. The central science fiction premise of the plot, that events have long since taken on a momentum of their own, and the outcome is inescapable, is completely upended by the television series focusing so much on the Emperor and his line of clone successors, which are not in the book, and the rise of a cult that threatens his supremacy, which is not in the book, and the aftermath of a terrible, catastrophic terrorist attack on the Empire's home planet of Trantor, which is definitely not in the book. In the TV series, Harry Seldon is brutally murdered right in front of us, dies right in front of us. In the book, he lives to an advanced age and is left holographic messages in the Terminus vault that fire up automatically after each predicted and necessary of the Seldon crises. In the TV series, the vault, for some reason, radiates a mysterious null field that keeps all living things away from it until it opens. A null field which Salvor Hardin is mysteriously resistant to, none of which is in the novel. Also, TV Salvor Hardin has visions of some kind, can see the future or see things through other people's eyes. No such thing in the novel. No telepathy, nothing like that. In the novel, it is critical to the success of the project that the Foundation staff remain ignorant of the coming fall of the Empire and the true purpose of their Foundation. They've been lied into doing this thing. They're supposed to be developing this Encyclopedia Galactica, which is just a ruse to get them all out to this planet. Any foreknowledge of any of this would change their behavior and risk screwing up the 1,000-year plan that Harry Seldon has laid out. In the television series, the Foundation staff already knows their role in preserving civilization after the fall. And this is a huge change from the original text and further screws up the central premise of the plot. Now, in project management, which I have done many times, And I imagine a lot of you out there have done too. One of the very first things you need to do on each project is figure out what's called the project's critical path. This means that out of all the many, many tasks that are part of any project, you determine which of them are critical to the effect on the total project time and what the best way is to schedule all the jobs in the project in order to meet a target date at a minimum time and cost.
The job of adapting stories is very much the same. The first priority is to become an expert on the source material, a total nerd, someone who can not only explain the story in depth, but understands why it works. Now, this is from an interview this month in Creative Screenwriting with Brandon Jacobs Jenkins, the screenwriter for Kindred, who was already a professional playwright when the chance to make Kindred came his way. Creative Screenwrite says, so when his agents asked if there were ever a TV show he would want to create, what might that be? Kindred was the answer. Jacobs Jenkins said, I had reread Kindred for about the 5th time in my life, and I thought that it could be a TV show, unquote. Once you have become an expert on the novel you want to adapt, then it's time to map out the plot's critical path. What are the minimum number of things that have to happen, and in what order to make the story work? And I think this goes back to what Golding said. It's structure, structure, structure.
Mm-hmm.
For example, in Dune, the Empire and all interstellar trade depends on spice.
The spice must flow, Blue Gal. The spice must flow.
Must flow. It must flow. Imperative that it flow. It is the most important resource in the galaxy and cannot be duplicated. It is the byproduct of giant, dangerous sandworms that can only live on one very hostile planet. Paul must travel to that planet. His royal house must be all but wiped out. His enemies must believe that they have won. He and his mother must join the Fremen, etc. Those are critical things to the story. Once you've done that, ideally, you should have a rough idea how many hours it should take to tell the minimum version of your adapted story. If it's a few hours, the optimal form is probably a movie or 2 or 3. If it's many, many hours, it should be a TV series. You got to work out a budget. You got to work out who's going to star in it. You got to work out all that. But first, you got to work out the structure of how you're going to present the story. And then you can go ahead and add as many ornaments as you wish, so long as your additions don't wreck or overwhelm the critical path. Do it right, and you can turn Octavia Butler's Kindred into what's turning out to be a pretty good, we hope, 2-season television series. Now, I don't think they have renewed it yet for a second season, which it is really ballsy to put out the first half of the book.
Well, and Denis Villeneuve put out the first half of Dune and said, hey, if you want to see the second half, let's see some Well,
and that's the point, isn't it? Because if you do it right, you can turn sandworms and Fremen into enough Oscar gold to fund a second movie, which is what Villeneuve did. Yeah.
Absolutely.
But you can also screw it up. And then you get Apple TV's big, visually impressive $45 million train wreck. Congratulations.
Yeah.
Respect the fiction, folks.
Do you want to
add anything else before we close?
It's just that there's so many examples of adapted material out there being done well or being done poorly. You've got The Big Sleep, which you got to understand. It doesn't matter who killed Sean Regan.
Yeah.
What matters are the characters.
The screenwriter didn't know who killed Sean Regan.
I don't know who killed the chauffeur. I don't know. I don't know what happened, but it doesn't matter. The point of that novel and that wonderful movie are the characters, and everything else is driven by the characters, by how they interact with each other and their past, and who you cast and so forth. So adapting material, when you have access, especially to the original novelist or the original screenwriter, as we said before, Glenn Ross, that whole first scene with Alec Baldwin that really kicks the movie off is not in the play. It was written specifically for the movie just to get it going, and it works great. So there's no reason not to change the original source material. It's not necessarily sacred. I mean, West Side Story is Romeo and Juliet, and I love West Side Story, and I love Romeo and Juliet. But you gotta love and understand the source material, and you gotta understand the third rail. Here's what you don't mess with. Here's what you don't touch. We want to do Dune, but the whole sandworm thing and spice seems a little weird. Can we do Kindred, but not with time travel, but with some other? No.
Train travel. We want to put her on a train instead.
Yeah. Or can we have her invent a time machine and voluntarily go? But no. So
the whole critical part of Kindred is she doesn't know how or why this is happening.
Right. It's involuntary, and it's violent. I'll spoil the novel a little bit. I believe she loses an arm in the novel because she gets like pulled back into the future into like a wall. So it does physical damage to her. In the past, she's beaten and tortured and so forth. It's not a happy, fun, pleasant story. It's a really good story precisely because it's involuntary. And it's this sort of magical thing that's happening that you don't know why and you have no control over it, but you kind of figure out why over time. They're just parts of novels you don't mess with. And sadly, in Foundation, all they needed to do was talk to someone who loves Asimov stories and understands why people are still fans of the Foundation 70 years later.
No, we're going to make a murder scene and then turn him into a hologram that talks to everybody.
Right.
And tells everybody what's going on. And
then we're going to fly to his home world. And again, there's stuff they added in that I don't have a problem with. If you want a big terrorist attack, fine. If you want to put your main character, your student, make it a black woman, that's great. Put her on a water world, that's fine. None of that. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about understanding the supporting scaffolding that holds the story up. That stuff you don't tamper with. And when you do, you break it. And when you break it, having spent $45 million, people like us are going to talk shit about you.
And Science Fiction University is a project of DGBG Productions. You can support the show by donating via Patreon or PayPal. Details at our website, sciencefictionuniversity.com. Thank you, Driftglass.
Love you, Blue Gal.
See you next time.
See you next time.